you an overview of what our hour and a half together would look like. We've essentially split it into two major parts. The first part will be dealing with student characteristics that affect learning at Waterloo, so very much focusing on the student side. And then we're going to flip that coin and we're going to look at the instructor side and look at teaching approaches that we can use to help accommodate this diversity of learners we have in any environment. And by that we mean in person or online. And finally, we want to land in a space where we're thinking about how we can use this information in our own coursework. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Erin and we'll get underway.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking today about the various factors that affect our students' experiences and their ability to learn in your classrooms. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about our students' motivations, what has driven students to select Waterloo as a university. You'll notice that this will influence their motivations within the class, as they often have chosen the university and the programs that they're studying in for their long-term vision. We have a lot of cooperative education influence at the University of Waterloo, and so that plays a big role in student motivations as well. Next, we'll spend some time digging into students' prior knowledge, their experiences and expectations. Often at the Student Success Office, we focus on that transition from high school to university. So we'll flush out some of the high school experiences and how those might impact your students if you're teaching first-year students. And then Monica will dig in a little later in the presentation into universal design for learning, which can help you ensure that you're reaching all students and in a good way in your classes. And then, of course, we would have discussed this anyway, but even more important at this time is understanding the school and life experiences of your students. We know that taking an interest in your students' lives and their personal circumstances when possible, or being sensitive to unique situations of your students, can really engage them as learners. And it's very important for students during this time. We'll also help you connect to campus wellness and accessibility services as important resources on campus for students as well. Okay, so let's dig into these topics a little bit more. The first thing we want to talk about when it comes to managing students' expectations is motivation. So we know that, as I mentioned, students have chosen the program that excites them, and they're very excited to be at Waterloo. They've also come in with relatively high average requirements, despite the faculty that they're coming into. So you might find that your students are motivated intrinsically by the topics that they are exploring. You might find that they are motivated extrinsically by the competitive nature of their program or by the draw of a particular co-op placement. And you might find that students are motivated by the future task value of the skills and knowledge that they're learning in your classes, especially when that information and the knowledge and skills you're teaching are directly relevant to future courses or to co-op jobs that they are aiming for. So what does this mean for you? Really, briefly, just keep these various motivational orientations in mind and think about how you can engage those motivations in different ways for your students. Next, we'll talk really quickly about metacognition. So when we think about the high school to university transition, specifically within the realm of Ontario students, knowing that that does make up a good portion of our incoming students, in the Ontario high school curriculum, there is a policy and new expectations that are built into the curricula where students actually are connected to metacognition, and they're graded on their ability to think metacognitively, which is a really big bonus for us. However, that might not be the case explicitly across the board for all students. So knowing that there will be differences in abilities for your students and whether they can identify their strengths and weaknesses as learners, and essentially what that means for you is building in opportunities when you can and prompts for students to be thinking about their thinking and to be helping them plan their self-regulated approaches. So how can they break down a task? How can they modify or adjust their strategies as they're working away? And how can you build in opportunities for them to reflect on that process? Next, we'll talk about time management, a very, very important one for our students, especially now while we're experiencing both remote and blended learning. In high school, we'll start there again. Many students' time management will have looked quite different than it will in university. From one point of view is that their instructors and their parents and all of the supports that are around them as high school students will often have really fleshed out what their time management looks like for them. In university, they're really responsible, obviously, for their own time management and may not have a solid set of skills in terms of what that looks like or anticipating how long assignments will take or how long it will take to review content. So the more that you can help students anticipate the time requirements for completing work and for completing assignments, especially in those early years, is really valuable for our students. Next is peer connections. So we know that peer connections and learning as a social activity is so important for our students. During COVID, in especially the online learning environment, this can be particularly challenging, and we definitely saw that with our students last year, that they're not in the spaces to create those meaningful bonds and build that sense of belonging on campus and within their classes as they would be if they were in in-person courses. So the other aspect to the peer learning piece is if they are in a remote learning environment, it can be very challenging in sort of just discussion boards to build that connection. So finding opportunities to connect your students in really meaningful ways will be super important. But also keeping in mind that just because they're young, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily familiar with technology or confident using that technology to build those connections. So just a prompt really to remind you to support your students in those connections where you can. Okay, continuing on. The next topic we'll talk about is late submissions. So in the Ontario high school curriculum, again, we'll go back to that high school perspective. There is a policy document that's been in place in Ontario high schools for about just over 10 years now, and it really looks at evaluation and assessment of students. And one of the main outcomes of that policy is a stipulation that any evidence of learning is still evidence of learning. And what that basically boils down to is that despite instructors having deadlines attached to their assignments, students technically have up until the last day of class to submit their assignments without penalty because they have submitted it and it is still evidence of learning. Now, obviously, that has major implications for university where, our deadlines are a little bit more strict, well, quite a lot more stringent. And we find that first-year students really struggle to change those expectations. And I've spoken with a lot of first-year instructors who kind of have an aha moment to say, well, that makes sense why they, really weren't kind of getting the fact that our deadlines are strict and expected. So I would say the main thing you can do here is just clarify your expectations. It might seem silly, it might seem really trivial to say, 11:59 p.m. on Sunday really does mean that unless you come to me with a verification of illness form or whatever your policy might be. But that will be an important message for students, is just really clarifying your policies for late submissions so that everyone's on the same page. And then we're going to talk a little bit about blended learning. So this is something that the university is definitely embracing this year. It's a shift again for students from the remote learning that we experienced last year. So you will find that students coming in have a little bit more experience with learning online, but the blended learning environment in particular will be a new experience for them. One where even in the remote environment, they struggle to manage their time. And now they have to balance courses that are being offered partially online, partially in person. Some courses will be fully in person, fully online, and really understanding the different requirements of all of those courses. We do notice that students are feeling a bit overwhelmed by that. So I would say the main thing you can do here is check in with your students, make sure they feel connected to you. We're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. But also just make sure that you're clear about what participation looks like in your course, what the expectations in particular for that online learning component will be, and then helping students navigate the in-person campus as well. Okay, second to last is feedback. So obviously feedback is a very important component of the learning process. In high school, students are often, again, I will caveat that this is from a Canadian and Ontario perspective primarily, feedback is often delivered regularly, almost weekly, in a written and a really detailed descriptive format. So students will be accustomed to receiving feedback. The process will be heavily guided by their instructors, I will note that. On the other side, you may have students coming from education systems where, you know, there isn't regular feedback and there isn't that sort of level of descriptive interaction with your students. So in essence, what this means for you is we know that providing regular feedback is very important. And when you can do that, it's great, especially if you can do it early in the term so students can have a sense of where they're at. Again, for students who may not be particularly skilled at assessing their strengths and weaknesses, this feedback is key. And then it comes the challenge of encouraging students to leverage and use and reflect on that feedback, which I will say ends up being the bigger issue. You put a ton of time into feedback. How do you ensure your students are actually using that to advance themselves? So clarifying your approach to feedback and your expectations around feedback, and really emphasizing and driving home that fact that feedback is an important part of the learning process will be important. And finally is academic integrity. So we know that this is a big gap for students coming again from high school to university and between education systems as well. The academic integrity policies at Waterloo are really fleshed out in our policy 71. However, there is a bit of a gap for students coming in from high school in terms of meeting the expectations. They often are coming in without the skills around citation and referencing and understanding at its core the skills that they need to develop to meet the expectations of the university. So as an instructor, it's important to, again, not assume that your students have these skills and learn the different resources that you can point your students to across campus to help them develop these skills, of which there are many resources available. Okay, so take a pause. Lots of stuff to think about in terms of managing expectations and understanding our incoming students and student body as a whole. We want to transition a little bit now to understanding the makeup of our student population. So we have a bit of an interactive question for you here, and that is, which faculty has the largest population of undergraduate students? So you should see the poll pop into the chat and up on the screen here. Go ahead and take your guess. Which faculty has the largest population of undergraduate only? We'll do another question for graduate students in just a moment. Okay, so it looks quite overwhelmingly that folks believe that engineering is the largest, followed by one voting for arts. Okay, so arts makes up 19% of our incoming student population, and I will suggest that or let you know that these numbers are reflective of our student body's makeup as of winter 2021. Next, we have engineering making up 26%. Math, 23%, science is 17%, faculty of health is 8%, and environment is 7%. So good job on guessing engineering, and you were not far off if you guessed arts. Okay, so what population do we believe makes up the largest population of graduate students? Okay, we have 6 votes for engineering this time. And 18% in arts, 32% in engineering, math is 17, science 13, health is 10, and environment 10. So you can see the populations are actually quite comparable between the makeups for undergrad and graduate students. It doesn't look like there are any surprises here based on the engineering being the largest makeup, but maybe there are some of the other faculties that you're surprised by the size of our student bodies. Okay. So the next thing we're going to go to is what draws our students to Waterloo. So we've seen some of the impacts that their student expectations can have on your practice, and you've got a better sense of the makeup of our student body. But what are the draws at a faculty level that really bring our students to Waterloo? So the first one we're going to poll again is which faculties see themselves as training employment-ready graduates? And you can select more than one option here. Put the slide back up for you. Oh, okay. So you're going to only have to be able to select one. Apologies for that. Okay, so we have, again, a high majority of engineering and one selection for mathematics. So, 2 faculties that really define themselves or market themselves to students as preparing employment-ready graduates are evidently the Faculty of Engineering and the Faculty of Arts. So the information on these slides is essentially marketing and recruitment information that we use to promote to students. So you can see the Faculty of Arts actually has identified combining passion with skills and experience needed for the future. And so one thing I will say here is that over the past few years, the Faculty of Arts has actually dedicated a lot of effort to really bolstering their co-op program and their experiential learning opportunities for students. I won't dig into that too much because Monica is going to dig in a little bit later around our co-op because that is such a big draw for our students. You can also see that making connections and solving problems, as well as being connected to the community, engaging in the world, are also important draws for students in the Faculty of Arts. Then Faculty of Engineering, we see the hands-on learning and the state-of-the-art facilities and the world-renowned co-op program. It's not a surprise that many of you chose engineering. We are really well known for our co-op engineering program. And so you can see a few other options that they've selected there that they're really drawing in students for that collaboration, that innovative spirit that we know underpins engineering, as well as being a global leader, and that entrepreneurial culture is really, really relevant as well. So interesting to note that these are 2 of our biggest faculties as well, and that we have that really strong focus in our faculties on the experiential learning opportunities. Okay, so next question for you is which faculties see themselves as training future leaders and change makers? While you're voting there, I will just clarify one thing about the employment-ready graduate slide. That's not to suggest that those are the only faculties that offer a co-op program. We kind of selected out of the 6 faculties 2 that really resonated with each of these themes. So in terms of employment-ready graduates, science and math are also faculties that do really emphasize that in their marketing materials. Okay, so future leaders and change makers, we see mathematics come up and engineering come up again. Okay, so here we're actually looking at the Faculty of Health, which previous to this year would have been known as the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences. So you might notice that change in language, and the Faculty of Environment. So the Faculty of Health really focuses on improving the quality of life for individuals and communities. They're really focused on that people aspect of their work. And then the Faculty of Environment is focused on the entire faculty dedicated to environmental and societal change. So interestingly, these are two of our smaller faculties, but they really are dedicated to being future leaders and change makers. And I will say the Faculty of Environment in particular is one of the leaders in the faculties of environment in the nation. So some interesting insights for you there. And we'll go to our last question, which is what draws our students in terms of being problem solvers and innovators? Okay. So a bit of a trick question here because we had two faculties left to highlight, but we see the Faculty of Science emphasizing this use of unique tools, technologies, and innovation to push the boundaries of science. The groundbreaking research and hands-on learning, and then the Faculty of Math is focusing on the community of asking questions and developing problem solvers. So this is a nice lead in. We'll stop for questions for a moment, but it's a nice lead into the next section where we're going to talk a little bit about deeper into about the co-op programs at Waterloo. So I'm interested to hear if you had any insights going through these activities, if there was anything that really stood out to you in terms of how the faculties are marketing themselves. Or in general, what questions do you have up to this point? And you can feel free to jump on the mic or put your questions in the chat. It's up to you.
I see we have some vigorous typing.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, for those students who never worked in in-person environment, who started with us when the pandemic, they don't know what the campus is. Shouldn't be like a special treatment for those students? Those who are exposed to both, they know what is the culture of a university, but those they don't even know what's the culture of a university. So is there anything specific for those sector of students?
That's a great question. And I would say that's actually something that the Student Success Office works really hard on every year. Even pre-pandemic times, we focus on that student transition programming, and especially last year and this year, helping students understand the expectations of the university, understand the culture of the university, connect to their peers, to upper year students, to instructors and advisors, to try and build that community and that sense of connection without having been to the campus at this point is definitely something that we're prioritizing. And in terms of like the logistical wayfinding, having never been to campus, that was something I heard you say earlier. There are opportunities for students to get campus tours, and they're exploring that for the early weeks of campus as well, because absolutely that's an important component for students to reduce their anxiety, is knowing where to go and how to get there.
Erin, we have a question in the chat that I think would be a one that we could attend to. It's about a bit more background about those students that are attending undergrad programs, a bit more information about the experience they have here in high school in Ontario and the minimum qualifications these students graduate with coming into university. And it's for those, if it's for an instructor coming from outside of the Ontario system.
Absolutely. So I have alluded to some of the key pieces that really pull themselves from that Ontario policy. However, I know Monica is sending the recording around and some additional resources. And one thing we can include in there is our team has actually created a bit of a chart that outlines some of the key components and impacts for students from that the Ontario education system. So that might be a nice add-on to the package that we send out. And it'll tease out some of the things that I talked about in terms of deadlines, feedback, academic integrity in a little bit more depth and put it into perspective for you as well.
We have another question in the chat, and this is a very specific question with respect to practical way to provide feedback in large class sizes. So very much now talking about it from the instructor side, what are some tips and tricks? So if I may, Sarisha, thank you so much for asking that question, and I hope I haven't butchered your name. Feel free to speak up and correct me. I would love
that is correct. Thanks.
It is correct. Thank you. Finally, thank you. I'm happy to attend to that question, but we are going to talk about it in like moments time, more from the instructor lens, the things you as an instructor can do when planning. We will speak from a meta level because we of course have to speak from on high before we come to specific course questions. But if I don't speak to your question, hold me to it at the end of this session and we'll return to it because it's an excellent question. One of the big pieces as instructors that we struggle with is regardless of what advice we get about teaching, it's about implementing it in any class size. Small classes can have their challenges as much as large ones. Sometimes folks think that a small class automatically is easier in many ways, but it also means that if you have one or two students who aren't quite performing the way you're hoping, either by connecting with their peers or in terms of their academic rigor, they can then, of course, have a bigger impact if it's a smaller group. Whereas in a bigger class, it doesn't proliferate quite as quickly. So there's pros and cons in terms of the challenges you might experience, but we will come back to it. So thank you for posing it.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
I see Kaylee's typing away, so I'm just going to wait and see if a question comes, and then maybe we'll move on to the second part.
Oh, sorry, I typed and I deleted, but I guess it still says I'm typing, but I'm not actually.
Do you have a question, Kaylee? Please, would you like to ask anything?
No, I was just going to make a bad joke. I did all my degrees at Waterloo, and the number of questions about how the faculties are promoting themselves now, I bombed those. That was useful to know kind of what the impressions are.
Thank you for sharing. We found it was very interesting when Erin and I started talking about how we discuss these topics from the two faces of our campus community, student and instructor, right? Those are basically the two main perspectives. It's fascinating what instructors think students are enrolling in and what they think they're going to study versus what the students think and believe they're enrolling in and going to study. So it's kind of a fun little exercise to go through just to be aware.
It's really helpful.
Awesome. So I think in the interest of time, if it's all right with everyone, we'll move along. But as I say, we're a small group, so just don't be bashful. Feel free at any time. I certainly don't mind you jumping in at any point. So let me just put it that way. As Erin said, our next area that we're going to explore is co-op. And it seems like, you know, the label, when you think about word association, you think Waterloo, you think co-op. And so we feel like we know about co-op. We know it's a thing at Waterloo and it dominates our environment. But just out of curiosity, I want to ask you a really simple question. Is it true or false that over 75% of our undergrad students are enrolled in a co-op program? Just a little test about what you know around our numbers and how prolific co-op really is on our campus. So the question will be coming up, and here it is. We'll give it one more moment. I think there's one more vote to come in. Not that it's going to break a tie or make a tie. All right, well, so it's actually false. And these numbers that you see here, this 68% is a pretty recent jump, because what happened not long ago, as Erin was actually alluding to in arts, is they had a real push in promoting co-op. They really increased their numbers and made it an opportunity in many of their programs. They really worked on building up cooperative opportunities within that faculty. But for a very long time, it was darn near close to 50-50. People always thought it dominated more, but it very much dominated depending upon where you are on campus. So if you are, for example, I just want to make sure that I'm hitting return here and it's not changing. There we go. Okay, so just evening out the numbers. So obviously the folks that are not in co-op are in a regular stream. I hope that was self-evident. There is no other form of study at Waterloo. There are the two options. So coming back to this idea of it depends on what faculty you're in is very important. Engineering, for example, is 100% co-op. So there is no engineering experience that is regular stream. There's no way of going through that program without experiencing co-op. On the flip side, there are other areas on campus that are very much not co-op based. So it will depend on where you teach, what courses you teach, and that will dictate the types of mixes that you have in your classroom space before you. So this is something really to bear in mind. The reason we raise this even as something to be a part of this presentation is that it will influence the dynamics in your course, whether it's an online course or an in-person course. Those students that are in co-op are always looking to leverage what they've learned, and especially as they work through their third and fourth and upper year students, they really want to make that connection to their classroom experience. But what this can do is, if you have a mixed student group, is to create sort of a dichotomy where you have the non-co-op and you have the co-op folks. And there can be a competitive spirit that's positive around this, and there can be a competitive spirit that's actually detracts from the classroom environment. So it's something to be mindful of, and to really ensure that all students are benefiting from that co-op milieu that is part of our university campus. So allowing the co-op students to contribute things that come from their experience, but allowing those students that are not in co-op but have other employment opportunities that could speak to their skills that they're learning and bring them into the classroom is really important. So you have that balance and camaraderie. The other thing to really think about is that the co-op experience itself is quite stressful and time-consuming, both of those things. And so you may be experiencing a dichotomy, not just because there's a competition between two subgroups, but because the co-op students, truthfully, at certain parts of the term are under duress. They're really pressured for time and may not be in attendance because they're going to interviews, or pressured for time because they're preparing for interviews. So they're competing. Their own time management is in competition. And this is the type of thing that certainly the Student Success Office does help students with time management. They do have workshops around this. But it's helpful for you as an instructor to be aware, so know what the periods of time are within the calendar, within a term calendar, that these activities happen. And it's usually at the end of the second month and start of the third month where the most intense period of hiring and interviews happens. So be aware of that. Think about how it influences your own schedule. Probably not a grand time to have a major project due or a major assessment. Think that through. Also consider how it might influence the attendance in your room. So if you have activities happening, there are people that will maybe drive some of your small discussion groups that are no longer present. Or conversely, maybe all of the folks that do the driving are the ones that are present. And so you don't have the reflective personalities in the space to offer up a different opinion or a different vantage point. So just something to think about and how it overlays on the way that you teach and lay out your particular course. And I do want to make one more comment around those students that are not in co-op. They certainly have access to all of the employment resources that are available in the Tatham Center. So it's something to encourage them. If someone is really keen, they've heard, let's say, a peer speak about their co-op experience, they're not in the co-op program, and maybe they approach you, you know they're a strong student, it's a nice way to really encourage them and motivate them to seek out those resources. They can get the same kinds of supports, preparing resumes, writing cover letters, that type of thing, searching for jobs. there are advisors for that. So encourage them to find these alternate ways to take advantage of a work experience. I'm going to move along now to talk about connections, because this is something that Erin alluded to early on, and it's pervasive in how we manage our classroom spaces, whether online or in person. It impacts dramatically on the experience for both instructor and student. And what do I mean by connections? Well, there's sort of the obvious connections to the real world, and the most obvious connection is the one we just came from, which is speaking about co-op. So this is a natural real world experience that's a part of the dynamic on our campus. But there are other types of connections that are real world connections that are also worth considering, and we'll talk about those. Instructor-to-student connections are imperative as well for influencing what that student learning experience is like. This is not surprising, but it's really more important that we bear it in mind front and center now than ever before, because we're not always in the same physical space with our students. So consciously thinking that through is critical. Student-student interactions. That was what Aaron was referring to as the sort of the peer collective. In a classroom or a course environment, there's parts of that interaction that are within your purview, things you can control, you can structure, you can guide, and then there are other parts that you cannot. And that's okay. And so kind of being cognizant of where those two reside and how they interplay within your course is really important when you teach. And foundationally, of course, student-to-content interactions. How are those built in? How are those fostered in your course? So what we're going to do is speak a bit more about each of these connections individually, just so we can explore them a bit more. So, as I said, in addition to co-op, there are other opportunities to create connection, real world connections for your students. And some of these are really simple and straightforward things. A classic example really is this notion of examples itself, making sure that what you've selected as examples are relevant to the time and the period, to the course, both in terms of content and level of the course. Also, current examples, things that are really timely, ideally things that are currently in the news. I come from, my background is in biochemistry, so as a STEM person, this last, 17 months has been like this wonderful opportunity to draw upon all this current topic discussion that's happening in the media, which yes, in the past was there, but never at this top level. So it's been quite actually stimulating to have very timely topics to draw on within a course. Bringing discipline experts, so people that represent your discipline, into your courses is a very powerful real-world connection. This can happen through special presentations, so guest lecture type folks, people that are experts in certain disciplines. You bring them in from the public sector or the private sector, pardon me. You can have Q&A panelists, setting that up for a classroom where folks can just pepper these panelists for a period of time and ask what they have top of mind, whether structured around a certain topic or more broadly if you're exploring professional development within your discipline. You can consider having externals as judges, discipline experts from off campus as judges for projects or presentations. That can be an extremely powerful way to create that real world connection within your course without actually having a co-op as a part of their experience. And the last one here is something called experiential learning. Co-op falls under experiential learning, but it is a specific type of experiential learning. Experiential learning in the very broadest sense really just means that it's learning that's based on students being directly involved in some kind of an experience. It's something that's not just digesting content that's been prepared for them, but doing something. It's that doing piece that is really critical. It's very interesting to note, I made a note of what the Ontario University's site, the information site for students, says, and they define experiential learning as education that occurs outside the classroom, so that's one of the key features, in a practicum, internship, or co-op setting. It allows students to gain hands-on learning through direct experience, so very much speaking to that practical piece. Again, in some disciplines like my own, that laboratory environment can often provide a very natural hands-on experience, but very much depends on how it's structured. If it's a recipe-oriented experiment, not as realistic as one would ideally like. Like there have to be these opportunities for failures, for decision making that need to be incorporated to really generate a true real world experience. So it's helpful if you are someone who is teaching a course that has any kind of lab or has any kind of atelier associated with it, if it's more of an arts department, anything that's that has a more performative type of course that it relates to it, to find out what's happening in those courses and be able to speak to them in appropriate sections within a course. Next, we'll transition to the student-to-student connections that, as I said, Erin referred to in the peer context. The reason this is particularly important is because it speaks to sort of supporting the emotional engagement, which the affective domain plays a huge role. I mean, we've probably seen this bolded, underscored, and capitalized in this remote teaching we've had in the last 17 months more than anything else. When folks are in isolation, they don't feed off of that energy. They don't feed off of that positive flow of growing understanding and that investment in one another. There's something truthfully magical about being in a group in the same place at the same time and invested in achieving similar goals and helping one another with challenges as you move along. So it's really important in some way to shape that experience and to allow students to, struggle together, come up with strategies together, think about within your course how that is managed. We are definitely going to be embracing blended learning for a long time coming. This is not going to go away. I would like to think it's our final shift in this roller coaster we've been on. But somewhere along the spectrum of in-person to online, we're going to stay somewhere along that midway. It's never going to be I shouldn't say never, that's an absolute, I should never say that. But it's rarely going to be one or the other any longer. It's going to be some mix. And so we have to be very thoughtful of how we allow for opportunities for these student interactions to develop in a positive way. There's also the collective sense of being with a group and developing connections that may have nothing to do with the course itself, but more connect the students to the broader community. And so that's more that personality and camaraderie piece that is mentioned in the last bullet. The one where you play a very big role, of course, is the instructor-to-student connection. These can be incredibly effective at building strong social teaching and cognitive presence in your course. And these are all different aspects of your teaching persona and your teaching role. I mean, the social presence is really important in terms of creating an authentic sense of community within a course. And this gives students a real sense of, who you are as an individual and why you are invested in the course. That's a really important piece. And as you can imagine, that feeds into things like motivation, because there's something about modeling your investment and your commitment that can't be replaced by anything else. Also understanding what it is about the discipline or the specific topics that you're exploring that has drawn you in. So more of that cognitive piece is really interesting for students to hear about. And in an online space, that teaching connection, that sort of teaching prep piece, that essence is developed through structure. So in an online LMS, your learning management system, it's how you organize things that almost creates that sort of place, a sense of place and order and meaning. It can happen more organically in person. And so some of us haven't really given it as much consideration. It sort of depends where your teaching hours have been spent. If more of them have been online, you've probably thought a bit more about that structuring piece, because you know that how you put your course together is a representation of you as an instructor. Whereas there are many magical instructors that can walk into a teaching room, a teaching classroom, and teach without any aids, literally without any aids, and mesmerize the people in front of them. So that type of an approach is very hard to capture in an online environment. So definitely it's a forte for the in-person, but things to bear in mind. And of course, cognitively ultimately talks about that construction of meaning and sense making and realizing the relevance of different pieces of content and concept and ideas and how they relate to one another. So these are just some summaries of what I've just been speaking. You want to model engagement and academic conduct. You are the discipline expert. You would like to show your students how that discipline expert manages to engage with you and how that is respective of academic integrity. This is one of those areas that Erin was mentioning is really a struggle for many of our students, where even basic citations are a real challenge. But the more you model it in your own teaching, the better it will be for them. Starting off on the right foot, this simply means making sure that the first time your students encounter you, either you as represented by your course online or you in person in the classroom, you set a tone, you set a certain way of being in that space for the group as well as for the course. That's very important, that front end piece. And then maintaining that front end piece through staying connected throughout the term, having some regular cadences, patterns, things the students can rely on and understand. This is particularly important as we move into blended learning being more the norm, because it looks different in person than it looks online. So for example, if you speak about announcements, you have to label them in a similar way in your LMS as you do in the classroom. Believe it or not, when you stand up and make announcements at the beginning of a class, you literally have to say, I'm now going to run down my announcements for the day before you move on to the content. Students may not actually identify that little front end piece as being your announcement space in person. We've done so many things so organically for so long in person that we often don't even think about how that correlates and matches against what's online. So that's something to think about. And of course, monitoring student progress. And what I mean about this is not hand-holding. I don't mean that. I do mean keeping an eye, though, on grades that might be trending downwards. And if there's a clutch of students that's in that group, reaching out to your students and asking what might be going on and attending to these types of things before they become an issue. Ultimately, it's to the benefit of the whole class, yourself, and your students. And feedback. Feedback we need to speak about multiple times because it is the one big growth mindset oriented piece in all instruction, teaching and learning. It has both sides of the equation that is critical. Our responsibility as instructors is to ensure that it's actionable, timely, and meaningful. You can provide feedback that is incredibly detailed, incredibly comprehensive, but ultimately you have to ask yourself, is that genuinely actionable? Is that genuinely the kind of feedback that can be received? We have to just be very thoughtful about what we're offering back to our students to really identify if it's serving the purpose of moving them forward. So there's lots of things around feedback that we can discuss, and this is something we'll return to for those of you joining me for the blended course design starting tomorrow, something we go into in more detail because it truthfully is important. We as instructors invest a lot of time in it. I sometimes fear we invest in it in the wrong way. Probably better to have less of it, but have it be transferable to the student and have the student understand what they're supposed to do with it than it is to have it be a laundry list that's meticulously and accurately put together, but ultimately won't be acted upon. And finally, we're going to land on the student-to-content connection, which is incredibly important because it's sort of the foundation of all coursework. So with very few exceptions, nearly all post-secondary courses require students to master some amount of content, some amount of material. And especially in the undergraduate level, they're centered entirely around helping students gain essential facts and processes and build sort of academic soft skills, if I may phrase it that way. And I would almost equate them to some of those metacognitive skills. It's not a direct correlation, but it it's a part of that conversation. They're learning how to learn. They're learning how to be students, and they're learning how to be students within your discipline, which probably looks differently than in another discipline. Not to say it's right or wrong, but there are these cultural discipline norms that exist that students have to make sense of. So what does interacting with content mean? Like, what do we even mean about when we say that? Anytime a student looks at an idea, looks at a fact, examines a principle, and it could be in a presentation in class, it could be reading something, watching something, it could be writing, listening, any of those things, they're interacting with content. And so essentially, when it comes to this piece, what your job is to manage two things. There's two variables basically here that you want to manage. One is the metacognition that I've just slightly alluded to, and this is embedding within your course aids for your student to actually explore that content in a way that doesn't just replicate what you have done. You as an instructor have packaged your material in a certain way, you sense made of it, you've provided a certain flow, but it's important that your students can unpack pieces and repack them in different ways. However, they need to build those tools. They need to actually understand how you break down a concept and build it up again. The classic example I can share is in biochemistry, buffers are everything. We need to obviously operate within very narrow pH ranges for most things to remain active. And so maintaining that is critical. And in every biochem course I've ever taught, there's been a struggle around how do you prepare a buffer and what does that, how do you actually get to that buffer range? And very early on, I recognized that one of the struggles comes from the fact that we always start with a pH of 0 and go up to a pH of 14. So my students all thought that you had to start there to get whatever buffering range we were trying to achieve. And they never understood you could actually start at the top and work down depending upon what materials you had on hand. And the aha moment, the opening of the eyes when students recognize this is phenomenal. But we as experts, we've been doing this for a long time. We don't even think about that. And we kind of do the raised eyebrow when students think that this is a new idea. But we have to every now and then step back and just recognize that we can't unlearn what we know. We already know it. But our students don't know it, and they don't know the content, nor do they know how to learn the content. So that's where metacognition comes into play. We need to support their ability to learn as well. The other one that's come up a number of times and is going to continue to come up is the motivation piece. This really plugs into many things. Very simply, it can be created. Motivation can be really built up by sharing of simply enthusiasm. As an instructor, probably the number one thing you can do to light a fire is to show your students how you care about what you're teaching and share how you became engrossed in this topic area. Now, sometimes we teach things we're not entirely engrossed in, so you can take the practical route. You connect it to why is this useful to you? Why is this relevant? And you know, it's that necessary evil to get through to get to where you want to be. But really having a grasp of some of those foundational concepts, of course, is critical in many disciplines. So motivation is really important, and it can be supported by those other connections that we've just, talked about, the connection to you as an instructor, the connection to their peers and their community. So connections are a big piece. And connections, in many ways, can be built into a course very well for all students by taking this universal design approach to creating courses and course experiences. Universal design for learning is one such framework, and what it provides is instructors a guideline, if you will, for structuring courses that allows a way in for all kinds of learners. So it's a gross oversimplification. We could probably a multi-day course just on universal design. But the important thing here to bear in mind is that you want multiple ways of doing things to allow ways into your course for different students at different times. Now, all of this being said, what you're not trying to create is ease of entry at all points. There should be some challenge, there should be some dissonance, but you want to ensure that that dissonance and that challenge isn't the same for the same group of students in your class all the time. If you teach only one way, you're always going to be challenging one subgroup and favoring another. Whereas if you have this overall flexibility and variability, you can better service a larger number of students. So essentially what I've said here, by using a variety of teaching methods, you can support access to your material for diverse learners, and it will benefit all of your learners, because what you're doing by modeling these different ways of teaching and learning, sharing different activities, is you're actually showcasing different ways that they can explore the content, which speaks to what we said about that content to student experience. You want it to be diverse so that students don't always think A has to come before B. If it doesn't, sometimes A does have to come before B, I understand that, but sometimes A can go at any point in a particular sequence. And by virtue of going through material in a singular pathway, we don't always showcase that. So this is really an important piece to bear in mind. We're just going to walk through then the three framework elements, just to unpack them a little bit. The what of learning is what is referred to as representation in the Universal Design for Learning framework. And in this particular case, what we're talking about is developing resourceful and knowledgeable learners, and we need to present material and content in different ways. So multiple means of engagement is what this particular element of the Universal Design Framework focuses on. Various ways, meaning it could be video, it could be text, it could be audio, it could be in person, it could be tactile, it could be completely silent. It can be a number of things, but to have that diversity around the representation piece. The why of learning is really the engagement piece for students. So what you're trying to do is to have purposeful, motivated learners, and we want to stimulate their interest and either provide motivation or build motivation. Usually there's always something present, you just have to find what that motivation is. And in this case, what we're looking for are different means of engaging and tapping into whatever those interests may be and challenging students then appropriately. A really simple example, again, just drawing on my own experience, teaching an introductory biochem course that is a prerequisite for folks going into optometry, pharmacy, medicine is a very different beast than teaching an early biochem course to biochemistry majors who want to explore the research aspects of biochemistry. You have a different audience, and so what you want to do is challenge them each appropriate to their own domain, and making sure that it's connected to what their goals are. And the third element within the Universal Design for Learning framework is the how of learning, and this is the representation piece. Action or representation is what it's referred to. In this particular case, what we're looking at is you want to develop almost that metacognitive piece as part of it, but also strategic and goal-oriented learners, and that are able to differentiate in the ways that they express themselves. And what you're doing here is finding alternative ways that they can demonstrate, that they can show that they have learned what they need to learn. Being really mindful of whether the method is directly tied to the demonstration. And sometimes it is. I mean, if what you're learning to do is write, you need to write. So writing is very then closely tied to what you're trying to demonstrate. It's not just the ability to grasp different grammatical constructs and expand vocabulary. The only way to demonstrate that is through that methodology, but not always. So a contrary example would be, is it necessary to have projects shared with the rest of a class as presentations? And you may feel that in your discipline, yes, that is important because that is the way your community, your discipline communicates. Fair point. However, just think it through and see if that's genuinely the case, or if you're defaulting to that because that is the way it's always been done, it's customary and students are familiar with it, or at least that's what you believe. But maybe there's an alternate way. Maybe there could be a poster presentation where there is no video or audio that needs to be composed, and it has different criteria, but the actual goals, the outcomes are the same. So these are the types of things that you want to consider. So how does universal design then overlay with course design? So with course design, of course, it allows for this diversity to be attended to in your learners. And what you're going to look for are, you want to consider these 4 categories. Let's just put it that way. Flexibility, I've already used that word a bit. You want to allow for flexibility within the way you lay out your course. An example here might be classically taking the weighting of a midterm and putting it onto a final. So a student knows that if that midterm doesn't go well, they haven't blown the course. Of course, you have to think this through. Does that, the material that's covered on the midterm, is it a cumulative final? So is it represented on the final? Because of course you have to assess for those learning outcomes associated with that front end material. So it may make sense, may not, but that's the type of thing you want to be thinking about. Clearly accessibility, super simple example. If you're choosing a video, just make sure there's an option for captions, that type of thing, thinking it through in your selection process. And variability. So here we might look at something like assessments. So providing a more equitable ways for learners to show what they know. We've spoken to that a little bit when I mentioned, that presentation. Does it have to be in that way? It's something to think about. Your answer may be that it is in fact necessary, and that's perfectly fine. But being aware, being conscious, making a conscious decision around it is what's important. Important in this area when designing a course, especially as we move into the blended arena. It's always been true, but the more complex the construct of a course gets, the more important this is. This is this notion of avoiding unnecessary labor, unnecessary effort. You want students to be spending time on learning and doing things that contribute to their learning, not spending time on things that don't contribute to their learning. So simple example could be, you have a reading list and you say to your students, well, read 2 of any of these 6. That may not be enough guidance for students because there's going to always be the subgroup that will be very stressed and feel they have to read everything to actually understand what you're trying to convey. A better approach would be to have 2 separate lists, the required list and a supplemental or a sort of a, if you're interested list, and indicate what perhaps the subtopic is that these different readings are highlighting and why they might want to explore them. But being more explicit like that truly helps to diminish stress and at the same time be more strategic with the time, which is something you want to model. The other area where universal design comes into play, of course, is on the instructional side. So when you're actually doing your teaching. And again, here, these are categories that you should be considering. Once again, accessibility comes into play. This is really simple when you're talking about content, you're talking about perhaps chunking it. That's one example of how you can make it more accessible in your teaching, rather than having this huge arc of information, try to make it subdivided into separate units. Again, this idea of variability is important. Here, an example would be an activity, because we're talking about instructional strategies now. Let's say you like to go to small groups. This is something you really enjoy as an instructor, and you feel that it has a lot of efficacy. But bear in mind that if you're always going to that one activity, you are always biasing for the students that enjoy and participate well in that, and against those who do not. Just think about there being some counterpoint, some other activity that may not pose the same kind of barriers to your students. That would be the kind of variability you want to consider. And of course, having a supportive class climate is super important, whether it's a virtual class climate or whether it's an in-person class climate. Again, feedback plays a big role here. If you're not timely in giving your feedback, that's sending a message and creating a climate in your classroom that you don't necessarily want. being supportive by giving students aids or suggestions on how to study the material that you've offered is super helpful way of being supportive within your teaching space and aids that classroom climate, because it creates that sense of you're both on the same team, which you are in a course. It's not about, you're not there as an instructor to hope that your students fail. You're there to support them in their success. And so that type of thing can be extremely helpful and beneficial. Big connect picture. We've been talking about all those other connections, students to students, students to instructor. It's really important that there is a sense of belonging, that there is that sense of it's a community within the course, because then the struggles are shared, and it's good to struggle together because it uncovers misunderstandings that you as an instructor then can clarify for everyone. And there's great benefit to that, because if there's misunderstanding on one concept, there's no doubt there's going to be misunderstanding on another. And by making transparent where the reasoning may have gone off the rails, it can help everyone in the group. So this is really important, is the sense of community. So we have communications across modalities, and this is where things really get muddy potentially. You have online meaning our learning management system, which for us is Learn, but also other tools that you use. You might use synchronous tools such as Teams or Zoom, perhaps Padlet, like some other app that's out there. And in person, yes, you have in class, but don't forget there are tutorials, there are labs. You might have meetings for teams, for projects. So there's lots of other communications that are happening. How are you making it consistent across all these modalities? And this is where we thought it'd be helpful just to have some input from the group. And so what we've created is we've created a Padlet, and we would like you to answer these questions. Add your thoughts on these questions to that Padlet. The first question is, what channels do you typically use as an instructor to communicate information to your students? And why have you selected that? Not surprisingly, our second question and follow-up is, what channels do you typically ask or expect your students to use to communicate with you? And why? Like, what are the thoughts behind that? And how do you clarify these two expectations? These are important questions to pose. So what Erin has done in the chat, she's added a link to the Padlet. Now you're going to go off into a separate tab now to answer this. This is online app, but we ask that you put your answers to these three questions and the whys in that Padlet, and we're going to share. This is anonymous, but it's going to be shared with the group, so we all have a sense of the kinds of thinking that we use when we're communicating with our students. So we're going to take, like, let's say 3-4 minutes to allow you to add your contributions to this Padlet. So please just click on the Padlet contributions and it will take you to that space. If you have any questions about how the Padlet works, don't be bashful, let me know. I see that we have people arriving, that's awesome. The way you add something is simply by clicking on the plus sign under the prompt that's at the top. So there are 3 columns. To add your response to any one of those 3 columns, click on the plus sign that's underneath the bubble that describes the question. So just in the interests of time, please keep typing. Don't be bashful. Keep adding to the Padlet. But I am going to turn to the Padlet and look at some of the things that you folks have offered. I'm super happy to see that under the how do you clarify expectations, there's the mention of the course syllabus. And this is really important because that is truthfully like the first in to a course for students. It is important that anything that is a practice is captured in that document. Some folks like to refer to it as a contract. That sounds very legalese, but it is a reference document. There's no question about it. It is the place for that. So the curious thing that I would like to ask, there's a number of you that have cited it, is how do you refer back to this document? What is your practice in pointing your students to this document for reference? How do you integrate that into your course? Since you've already compiled all of your information there, how do you point students back to it? And feel free to jump in, anyone at this point. I see a few comments under the that third column that speak to the course website. I am curious then if when you say course website, do you take the same verbatim explanation for a particular question, for a particular communication, let's say pathway, like you're trying to make it clear how students should reach out to you and what format they should communicate with you? Do you take verbatim out of your course outline, that description, and pop it into an announcement? How do you do that for your students? Like, how do you make sure that the language is similar and that they are being guided back to the original document? As you think about that, feel free to drop your response into the chat. If you prefer not to come on live, that's fine. The other one that I'm seeing here that's very interesting in both the communication out to students and requests back from the students are Piazza and emails. So Piazza makes sense to me that it's a back and forth right within that space. There's a discussion happening. Emails, I'm curious how anyone can feel free to speak up about this. Do you use emails within the LMS? Is that your preference within the learning management system? So in our case, Learn, or do you like students to email you directly to your UW address? What's your preference there?
I think as instructors, we're very silent today, so I would speak up, unmute myself. I typically ask them to directly email me and copy my TA if it's okay, but because I have had like some instances of issues with the online system, if it goes through the Learn or something. So I explicitly also include that in the syllabus as well and ask them to include a title in the subject so I don't miss out those emails. I think based on this practice for the past few years, that's the best thing I could manage to do.
Absolutely fair enough. Yes, and I heard you say that it's sometimes because there are hiccups with the learning management system. And I've heard that that's one management method for instructors. Absolutely. Conversely, of course, one can email within the LMS, but it is very important when making that clear to the students that they understand that those are two separate email spaces. Sometimes that's not obvious to a student. In fact, many students, Eric, maybe you can speak to this, many students email, just getting them to email is a major effort.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. A lot of the messaging that we send to students is around this help-seeking behavior and the expectation at university that, you need to recognize in yourself when you need to ask for help, whereas in high school, often help is coming to you from various sources. And so just that application, learning how to be an advocate for yourself and reach out for help. And that's true of instructors and TAs, unfortunately, as well for students. So yeah, great point.
If there are any questions about these channels of communication, how we make this abundantly clear, how they're woven together, I'm happy to take any comments, any thoughts around this, because this truly, in some ways, is probably at the heart of everything we've been talking about today. Communication is really important with our students, and we have certain limited channels for doing that, and ensuring that both the communication out and the communication back occur on an even playing field is really critical for all aspects of the teaching and learning space. It can really be the block to teaching anything if you can't get that communication set up. Kaylee, go ahead. You've got a hand. Please go.
I was wondering, this is I think I have a lot less experience teaching than everyone else here, so I'm open to hearing everyone else's practices too, but how you manage those emails that come in at 3 a.m. Do you encourage a policy or give students an idea of you can expect to hear back from me within 48 hours, or how do you manage that onslaught of emails so that you don't get totally washed away with it?
That's a brilliant question. And I'm going to offer your colleagues the opportunity to respond first, please. What are people's strategies? I mean, you've mentioned one, Kaylee. You mentioned sort of the turnaround 48 hours, very reasonable. What are other approaches folks take?
Personally, if I am awake, I will respond. That's especially with the pandemic. I always sympathize with the students. I feel they are under a lot of pressure. So whenever they communicate, as you said, having multiple channels, like for example, Piazza, if there's something for discussion, they will post it there. And we go, and myself, the TAs, and sometimes their colleagues respond. But when the students contact me, usually they contact me if they need some help on specific things. So if I am awake, I will respond. If I'm not, then whenever I see the email, I will respond. This is my strategy, especially in the pandemic.
Thank you. No, thank you very much for sharing that. And you've also made a really great point. It depends almost on the medium in which they're communicating, because you know that if it's directly to you, it's probably of a different level of urgency than if it's via a discussion board or via some other mechanism. So that's a really good point as well. In the interests of time, and I do appreciate these contributions, and Kaylee, do you hold me to it? Because you also added the question about the class size, which I didn't return to, but I assure you I will answer. So please hold me to that after this event. But I do want to make sure that we finish off our slides here. So I just want to sort of summarize the things that you can do as an instructor. Straightforward, but this is sort of the bullet list. Meet students where they are, and this means knowing who they are. So in some way, you've got to figure out what are the bums in the seats, whether they're virtual seats or whether they're, in person in the classroom. Do you know, are they all like 1B students? Is that the way it works? Is it a cohort-based situation like in engineering? Or is it possible that you have a mix? You have everything from 2A to 4B in your class. Are they folks that are majors? You need to know something about the students that you have, and some mechanism for figuring that out pretty early on. Foster those connections, like really be mindful. If you're doing something in your course, do it for a purpose and ensure that it takes into consideration how connections are being made through that something. Whatever the activity, whatever the piece, the construction piece in your course is, think about how it actually helps foster connections to you, to your between your students and to the content. We can't say it enough, so we're going to really hammer it home, but being explicit and making sure that your expectations are communicated clearly, and then also the communication itself is simple and clear. Sometimes saying things in minute detail makes it less clear than making it simple and ensuring that it's actually read. Think about, there's a balance between offering information and actually making sure that offer is accepted. Modeling learning processes, modeling in general, just very important that you demonstrate how, as a discipline expert, you go about making sense of information, how you go about solving a problem, how you think about packaging and parsing information, all of those things. You model so many things as an instructor, and that's important to bear in mind. Varying your teaching methods, really great idea, not just for the diversity of students, which is really the whole purpose of this particular session, but also because it challenges you. When you go into doing something differently, you suddenly refresh. It's like a reset, and you have to think about presenting your ideas in a different way. And that's really healthy. To sometimes step back and do it afresh means that you're refamiliarizing yourself with the learning process. So we still, we're almost there. We have a minute left, but Erin and I wanted to make sure that we actually got to this point and had you think about, before you leave, what are you thinking about now that we've shared this information with you, and how will this information that we've shared help to inform your future thinking? You don't have to share this with us, but leave this as a reflection point for yourself as you leave this session, so that there's something from this session that you take away as an action piece that you sit with, and get back to us by all means if you have any questions whatsoever. Here's our contact information. As Erin mentioned, we're going to be sharing this presentation with you, both the slide deck itself, so that you can quickly flip through, but also the recording. And if you have links, we'll share some links. We'll share the Padlet link that we mentioned and resources on both our websites, meaning the Center for Teaching Excellence and the Student Success Office. On behalf of both of us, Erin and I want to say thank you so much. Happy to take your questions. Stay back if you have some. If not, have an awesome afternoon. And for those of you that will be taking the course design, we'll see you tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. Great to see faces. Thank you for coming online on camera.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about the learning management system. I just started, so I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, certainly. So we have a Desire to Learn product. It's a D2L product.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And we call it Learn. So
Got it.
When you see capital Learn, that's what we're talking about.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
So do we access it like just Waterloo plus Learn, and it should pop up?
So do you currently have a sandbox? Oh, if you just arrived, okay, if you just arrived, we have to actually create your presence, your identity within Learn.
Oh,
so the best thing to do is if you would like to get going, get in touch with Learn Help. So it's truthfully just Learn Help at Waterloo, and just tell them you're fresh. You need to create an account. Can they please put you in?
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
You're so welcome. No worries at all. Thanks for hanging around, Kaylee. And I do apologize I didn't get to your big class question, but I'm serious. Make sure that you send me an email poke. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to head off now and wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you, Erin.